It was a dark October evening in 1940 when two Heinkel H111 bombers came in low over the black water of the North Sea, heading for the very top corner of Scotland. Their orders were simple and brutal. Find the RAF airfield at Wick, drop their bombs on the runways and hangars, and get back across the water before the British fighters could intercept them. The crews knew the route by heart. From Norway, across the sea, then in over the cliffs of Caithness. Somewhere inland, the glow of a coastal town and the hard, straight lines of runways would appear in the gloom, and that would be their target. This time, though, something was different. As the bombers crossed the coast, the navigator in the lead aircraft peered down through the dim light and saw exactly what he had been trained to look for. A neat pattern of runways forming a triangle, bright points of electric light marking out a flare path, little clusters of buildings, and the suggestion of aircraft shapes standing on dispersal points. From the air in the half-light it looked like a textbook RAF station. The bombers lined up, opened their bays and released their loads. Explosions walked across the airfield, throwing up columns of earth and smoke. The air gunners reported fires starting on the ground. The crews turned for home, satisfied that they had struck a serious blow against fighter command. Except the airfield they had just bombed did not exist. The bombs fell on grazing land near a tiny village called Sarklet, several miles away from the real RAF station at Wick. The runways were simply strips of ground cleared and levelled to look good from above. The hangars were painted canvas and timber. The aircraft were wooden mock-ups and clever shapes made from scaffolding and tarpaulins. The lights were controlled from a hidden concrete bunker where two RAF men sat with a generator, a telephone line to Wick, and a set of switches that could make an empty field look, for all the world, like a busy operational airfield. That was the whole point. Sarkler was one of more than 200 decoy airfields that Britain built during the Second World War to confuse German reconnaissance and drag bombs away from real targets. In official documents, it was a K site by day and a Q site by night, part of a national deception program so secret that many of the people who lived next door to these fake aerodromes never knew what they really were. From the German point of view, though, it looked like something else entirely. An airfield that seemed to grow, shrink, and even move on the map. One month an aerial photograph would show a modest base at Wick. A little later, reconnaissance images suggested that another field, a few miles away, had sprouted runways and aircraft of its own. On some nights there were lights in one place, on others they appeared somewhere slightly different. The Luftwaffe's intelligence officers could never quite be sure how many airfields were up there, or which ones were real. To understand how one fake airfield in the north of Scotland could drive enemy reconnaissance crazy, you have to wind the story back to the very beginning of the war, to a civil engineer named John Turner and a radical idea about how to fight bombers with illusions. When war broke out in 1939, British planners fully expected the Luftwaffe to go after airfields, aircraft factories, and later whole cities. Air defence meant more than just fighters and anti-aircraft guns. It also meant confusing the bombers so that, even when they reached Britain, they would hit the wrong place. Colonel John Turner, a retired Air Ministry officer with a background in construction, was put in charge of a small, very secret department with a strange mission. Build targets that didn't matter and make them look more attractive than the ones that did. Turner's first creations were decoy airfields, known as K-sites. They were usually laid out on farmland, heath, or even disused First World War airstrips. From above, they had all the visual cues that a Luftwaffe crew expected. Level rectangles of runway scraped into the soil, mock bomb dumps, fuel stores, small clusters of buildings, and most importantly aircraft. Those planes were never meant to fly. Some were old civilian machines dragged out of retirement. Others were wooden shells, canvas shapes stretched over frames, or even aircraft silhouettes painted onto the ground. The trick was that they had to look convincing from 1,000 to 2,000 metres up, often in poor weather, often at night. Turner borrowed talent from the British film industry set designers, lighting experts, and artists who knew exactly how to create illusions on a tight budget. What mattered was not that a dummy Hurricane looked perfect from 10 meters away, but that its wings and shadow read clearly on a blurred reconnaissance photograph. By 1940, Britain had around 100 of these dummy airfields and several hundred dummy aircraft spread across the country. They were always placed close enough to real stations that a bomber crew, approaching at night or through cloud, could easily mistake one for the other. During the day they sat silently, their fake planes dragged into new positions from time to time so that successive photographs would show aircraft coming and going. At night, though, the really sophisticated work began. The Air Ministry designated nighttime decoys as Q sites. Instead of physical aircraft, they primarily used light. Long rows of lamps on poles mimicked the flare path of a real runway. Obstruction lights picked out hangars and control towers. A powerful movable lamp, the Chance Light, and nicknamed Scarecrow, swept across the ground to simulate aircraft lining up, taking off, or taxiing. All of it was controlled from a concrete bunker, usually manned by just 2 men at a time, one at the generator, one at the lighting controls and the telephone. They had a simple routine. When an air raid warning came through from the parent station, the off-duty man was shaken awake. The generator was started, the appropriate pattern of runway lights switched on, and the Chance Light began to play over the makeshift airfield. An Air Ministry order in 1940 spelled it out in dry bureaucratic language. One man on the control panel, the other on the headlamp, both listening intently for the sound of engines in the dark. It was tense, monotonous, and dangerous work. The crews lived in tiny bunkers, often half buried in hillsides or fields far from towns. They were not allowed to talk about what they were doing, not even with their own families. Yet when bombers homed in on their fake flare paths, those 2 men might be the only ones within miles of where hundreds of high explosive and incendiary bombs were about to fall. One decoy operator, Paddy Riley, later recalled that his site alone claimed about 200 bombs during the Blitz, including an unexploded 1,000-pounder that had to be dug out of the ground. The system worked better than almost anyone had dared hope. Reports from 1940-41 show that some night raids were drawn almost completely onto decoy targets once the dummy lights were lit, leaving real airfields and factories untouched. Crews like Riley's kept careful note of the craters and burn marks around their sites. Their scores were deliberately underreported in case anyone accused them of exaggeration. But the most sophisticated piece of deception around Wick was not just about lights. It was about maps, photographs, and the mental picture inside a German intelligence officer's head. RAF Wick sat in a strategic position at the very tip of mainland Britain. From there, fighter and reconnaissance squadrons watched the North Sea, escorted convoys, and monitored German activity in Norway. For the Luftwaffe, taking Wick out of action, or at least disrupting it, promised easier raids on Scotland and the northern shipping lanes. To protect it, the Air Ministry authorised a decoy station nearby. Engineers arrived at Sarklet and began reshaping ordinary farmland into something that would look, from above, like an airfield. They bulldozed long straight strips into the earth to form runways, laid out perimeter tracks, and dotted the area with building shapes. Artists and carpenters constructed dummy aircraft and vehicles. Cartographers in London then performed a neat trick. On some official maps, they drew Sarklet as if it was the real airfield complete, with standard RAF buildings in all the right places, while Wick appeared less prominent. From the German side, reading captured charts or interpreting aerial images, it could easily look as if a new airfield had appeared, or as if Wick had somehow grown a second station a few miles away. Now imagine being a Luftwaffe photo analyst in 1940. You sit in a dimly lit room staring at black and white prints taken from high altitude. One week the photos show a certain pattern of runways and dispersal points near Wick. A month later, another set of pictures shows bright new strips of concrete and a different arrangement of aircraft just down the coast. Are there now 2 airfields? Has the RAF expanded the site? Are they moving aircraft back and forth between them? In reality, what you're seeing is a choreographed illusion. The dummy aircraft at Sarklet have been dragged to new positions. Some have been taken away, others added. A dummy bomb dump appears where there was none before. At night, sometimes Wick stays dark while Sarklet lights up. On other occasions, the pattern is reversed. To analysts trying to track the strength of RAF squadrons in the north, it must have seemed as if the base itself was shifting under their pens. This is what we mean when we talk about the airfield that kept moving. It did not sprout wings and fly, of course. The buildings and runways at Sarklet never changed their physical location. But on paper, in the mind of the enemy, the RAF's presence in Caithness looked fluid and uncertain. The more the decoy crews played with lights, shadows and dummy planes, the more they scrambled the enemy's mental picture. We know that the trick worked because German bombers repeatedly attacked the Sarklet decoy instead of the Wick. Local accounts and wartime records describe several raids where aircraft came in from the sea, homed straight onto the lights of the fake aerodrome, and dropped their bombs on empty fields. On 26th October 1940, for example, 2 Heinkel A111s approached the area at dusk and bombed the Sarklet site, having mistaken it for the real RAF station. Even today, it is believed that dozens of unexploded bombs still lie buried deep in the peat around the old decoy. The illusion was so persuasive that it did not only fool the enemy. Accounts from Sarklet tell of at least 2 British fighters and 1 bomber that tried to land on the airfield in bad weather, mistaking the decoy lights for the real thing. Other Q-site operators around the country reported similar incidents, which is why the Air Ministry eventually ordered a bar of red lights to be placed across the dummy flare paths, a visual "do not land" sign for friendly pilots in trouble. Sarklet was only one piece of a vast deception network. Across Britain, K and Q sites were joined by QL lighting decoys that mimicked the glow of railway yards and factory complexes, and starfish sites, special fire decoys designed to look like entire cities burning after an air raid. These starfish sites used carefully arranged fires of oil, wood, and even water-mixed creosote to replicate the pattern of incendiary damage that German bombers expected to see. By the end of the war, there were 237 starfish sites protecting 81 British towns and cities, on top of around 230 dummy airfields and hundreds of other decoys. Modern research estimates that these decoys diverted up to 5% of German bombing effort, away from real targets, around 1,000 tons of bombs that fell into empty countryside instead of onto houses, factories and runways. One particularly striking example of a decoy airfield success comes from RAF Sutton Bridge in eastern England. There, a Q site on Terrington Marsh was set up 4 miles away from the real airfield, with an elaborate light system to mimic a runway. On the night of 30-31 August 1940, the Germans mounted their first serious bombing attack on Sutton Bridge. Instead of hitting the real station, they dropped multiple bombs around the decoy flare path, while the true airfield escaped major damage. Cases like this were repeated all over the country. The people who served at these sites rarely considered themselves heroes. Most were ordinary airmen or members of the Royal Engineers, doing long night shifts in cold bunkers, drinking tea and listening for engines. Many of them felt strangely detached from the war. They almost never saw the enemy up close, but they lived and worked in places that were deliberately meant to attract bombs. Only decades later did historians start to piece together the scale of what they had done. The official history of the programme, Colin Dobinson's book Fields of Deception, was not published until 2000. In Sarklet, the decoy aerodrome eventually slipped back into farmland. The dummy aircraft were dismantled, the temporary structures knocked down. For years, the story of the airfield that wasn't there survived only in local memories and a scattering of classified documents. Recently, however, researchers and writers such as Rob Moore, whose family farm lay under the fake runways, have brought the tale back into the light, showing how a small Scottish community accidentally became one of the most bombed places in Britain without ever hosting a real squadron. There is another, more playful legend that hints at just how convincing these illusions could be. In occupied Europe, the Germans themselves built fake airfields complete with wooden aircraft, hoping to fool Allied bomber crews into wasting their bombs. According to a long-standing story, one Allied unit, spotting such a wooden aerodrome, supposedly dropped a single large wooden bomb on it as a joke, with the words "wood for wood" painted on the side. Historians now think that many details of this tale are exaggerated or apocryphal, but serious research into it has found that both sides in the air war were constantly playing games of deception, counter-deception, and dark humour. Whether every detail of that wooden bomb story is true or not, the fact it exists tells you something important. Pilots and crews spent a lot of time worrying about whether the airfield or factory below them was real. Every time a bomb load fell on a decoy site instead of a real target, the deception planners had done their job. From a modern military point of view, what makes the story of Sarklet and the other decoy aerodromes fascinating is not just the cleverness of the tricks, but the way they attacked the enemy's decision-making loop. A bombing campaign depends on accurate intelligence. Reconnaissance aircraft take photos, analysts count aircraft, measure runways, and identify new buildings. Planners decide which targets to prioritize. If you can quietly corrupt that process by feeding it convincing but false visual information, you are effectively moving your airfields around on the enemy's mental map. The Germans did adapt. As the war went on, some bomber crews were warned about decoy sites and told to look for certain giveaways, runways that looked too perfect, lights that seemed oddly isolated, fires that did not spread the way real incendiary blazes would. But in practice, those distinctions were hard to make from a shaking aircraft at night, with searchlights and flak all around. British decoy designers kept adjusting their patterns too, changing lighting layouts and fire arrangements as real RAF stations altered their own procedures. In the far north, Sarklet did its quiet work until the direct threat to Wick faded and Luftwaffe attention shifted elsewhere. Germany's resources grew thinner and the tide of the war turned. Eventually the lights at the dummy drome were switched off for good. The bunkers were sealed, the cables ripped up, and the site was officially declared safe, though, as locals will tell you, that does not necessarily mean every bomb was found. Today, if you walk across those fields, you might not guess what once stood there. The concrete control bunker still exists, half hidden under grass and scrub. Aerial photographs taken now show faint traces of old runways and tracks, ghost lines in the landscape. The farmers who work the land plough straight across what used to be flare paths and dispersal bays. Sheep graze where wooden hurricanes once stood. Yet for a few crucial years in the early 1940s, that quiet patch of Caithness countryside was one of the most effective weapons in Britain's air defence armoury. It absorbed bombs that would otherwise have smashed into Wick, Skitton or Castletown. It confused Luftwaffe reconnaissance about how many airfields the RAF really had and where they were. It forced German planners to spread their efforts thinner, never quite sure whether they were looking at a vital base or an elaborate mirage. When we talk about World War II aviation, we often focus on the glamorous side, the ace pilots, the famous dogfights, the sleek fighters and heavy bombers. But there was another side to the air war, fought not with bullets and propellers, but with plywood, paint, electric bulbs, and the imagination of a handful of engineers and artists. The airfield that kept moving was a product of that quieter battle, a reminder that sometimes the most effective way to survive an attack is to convince your enemy that you are somewhere else entirely. In the end, that is what Sarklet and the other dummy drones achieved. They turned empty fields into magnets for high explosives. They twisted the straight lines of runways into optical illusions. And they taught future generations of planners a lesson that still holds in the age of satellites and precision weapons. If you can control what the enemy sees, you can shape what the enemy believes, and in war, belief can be as deadly or as protective as any gun.